afternoon. I am Afira Firdaus and I welcome all attendees from Pakistan and abroad on behalf of Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad, at our today's webinar on the topic 2 decades of India-US Strategic Partnership, Impact on Strategic Stability in South Asia. I thank all the participants for sparing time for this event. We will begin the proceeding with the verses from the Holy Quran. Jazakallah. I would now like to request Ambassador Ali Sarva Nakhvi, Executive Director of CISS, for his welcome remarks. Ambassador Ali Sarva Nakhvi, in a long diplomatic career of 36 years, served at various diplomatic assignments, including the United Nations, both in New York and Vienna, and in Washington, D.C., London, Paris, and Brussels. Ambassador Nakhvi was appointed member Chairman's Advisory Council in Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission after his retirement from Foreign Service, where he functioned as advisor to the Chairman PAC on International Affairs. Ambassador Nakhvi is founding executive director of Center for International Strategic Studies, which was established in 2010. You have the mic, sir.
Thank you, Afira. It's indeed a very great pleasure. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to this fifth CISS webinar because we have done four webinars before this in this troubling times of the coronavirus. But the webinar, I think, is a technological leap for the think tank community as well as the various other forums, as it has introduced many of us to this channel of communication. I, for myself, have benefited immensely. I welcome the distinguished speakers, the scholars and experts, the students and media representatives, as well as the diplomatic representatives and the foreign participants to this event. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of our discussion today is 2 decades of Indo-US partnership, impact on strategic stability in South Asia, which needs a proper and full examination due to the many implications and ramifications that emanate from this relationship. The evolution of the partnership is perhaps one of the major geopolitical developments of the last 20 years. In my view, it goes back even a decade earlier than that. When I was in Washington in 1992, President Clinton had assumed office in his first term that year. I could hear very active discussions being made in the think tank community in Washington of starting a new relationship with India. The Carnegie Endowment brought out a monograph strongly recommending that such a step be taken by the US. The Afghan war had ended with the first Afghan war with the, well, first in this present day contemporary context with the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The Afghan war had ended with the withdrawal of the then Soviet forces from that country, and the US did not have much use for Pakistan any longer. It was therefore looking at South Asia in a new perspective in which India figured prominently. Be it as it may, the shape of its new relationship with India began to materialize in due course. I came back to Islamabad and I saw President Clinton's much heralded visit to India take place in March 2000, during which he made a 5 hour, somewhat a controversial stop in Pakistan, which visit I handled, a very brief visit, which I handled as Assistant Foreign Secretary in the Foreign Office overseeing the Americas desk. Anyway, that is the broader framework of this subject. Coming to this webinar, its objective, as is specified in the title, is to assess the development of the Indo-US strategic partnership in the last 2 decades and how it has and will impact the peace and stability in the South Asian region. United States bilateral and India's bilateral ties have leapfrogged into an enduring strategic partnership over the last 2 decades. Both India and the US have their reasons to build on their strategic partnership. India sees the US as an important source of weapons and technology. It also seeks US political support, which would increase its power and influence in the region. The US, on the other hand, wants to get a big share of India's military procurement. It wants to beef up India's military might to make it a counterweight to China, and has eyes on India's huge domestic market for its own economy. Thus, it sees a major partner and ally in India. Over the years, India's well placed diaspora in the US has put its enormous weight in advertising India as the most effective strategic counterweight to China before the Congress and the US security establishment. This has become the basis of a new era of US India relations, with the US designating India as a net security provider in the Indo Pacific and a key member of the quadrilateral group against China, notwithstanding India's robust and long-standing defense collaboration with Russia. The first step in forging the US-India ties was the General Security of Military Information Agreement, GSO-MIA, concluded in 2002. This was followed by the conclusion of the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership, NSSP, in 2004, and the new framework for the India-US defense relationship, signed in 2005, that paved the way for a broad spectrum US-India defense and strategic cooperation in the domains of civil nuclear, civil space, high technology, military trade, and missile defense. The 2006 India-US Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, also known as the 123 Agreement, paved the way for the exceptional and unprecedented waiver to India in 2008 by the Nuclear Suppliers Group without any corresponding obligations that usually follow for any NPT signatory state. The US has also helped India in gaining membership of 3 multilateral export control regimes: the Missile Technology Control Regime in 2016, and the Wassenaar Agreement in 2017, and the Australia Group in 2018. In June 2016, the US also designated India as a major defense partner that puts India at par with the closest US defense allies and partners. The same year, both countries also signed the Logistics Exchange and Memorandum of Agreement, LEMOA. In 2018, the US and India signed the Communications Compatibility and Security Arrangement, COMCASA. These agreements have such big acronyms. It started the 2+2 ministerial dialogue between their defense and foreign affairs counterparts, coupled with the grant of the Strategic Trade Authorization Tier 1 status to India. The latest of the 4 foundational agreements GSOMIA, LEMOA, COMCASA is the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, BICA, concluded last month. Since 2008, India has purchased 21 billion worth of high-tech conventional military hardware from the US alone. These agreements have coincided with the largest and most ambitious expansion in India's uh, modernization and build-up of its armed forces. It has also made unparalleled progress in its civilian and military space programs. And it has conducted more missile tests in the past 2 months than ever before in such a short time frame. India is being propped up as a net security provider for the Indo-Pacific and South Asia in this manner. All these developments will have far-reaching and enduring implications for regional security and will grossly undermine strategic stability. Ostensibly against China, the US-India's strategic partnership as India's other strategic defense collaboration with other major arms suppliers directly impact Pakistan's security by exacerbating existing asymmetries that are driving shifts in force postures and are fueling offensive conventional and nuclear doctrines in South Asia. In this context, the Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad, is holding this webinar that focuses on the four key areas that I have mentioned. We will have both Indian and Pakistani perspectives on India's space, missile, and nuclear programs. We'll also cover how India-US foundational agreements are pivotal to India's emerging military capabilities and the 2 decades of India's nuclear program development. We have four distinguished speakers to talk about these important aspects of the India-US strategic partnership. From our center, we have Dr. Naeem Salik and Dr. Mansoor Ahmad. We have Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan from India and Dr. Adil Sultan from Air University, Islamabad. We hope that the webinar will present an informed and realistic picture of the issue and generate a fruitful discussion. I wish the participants a very worthwhile session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Nakhvi. We have four speakers in our panel today. Before we proceed further, I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Naeem Ahmad Salik. Dr. Naeem Salik is a senior research fellow at the Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad. He has PhD in political science and international relations from University of Western Australia. He has been a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center, Stanford University, Brookings Institute, and School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He has served in Pakistan Army, including Director Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs at the Strategic Plans Division. He is the author of 2 books, Genesis of South Asian Nuclear Deterrence and Learning to Live with the Bomb, published by Oxford University Press. He has also edited 2 books titled India's Habituation with the Bomb and Nuclear Pakistan Seeking Security and Stability. Our second speaker is Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan. Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan is professor at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He previously worked as ICCR Visiting India Chair for Political Science and International Relations Program at Victoria University, Wellington in 2011. He was member of Executive Council of Indian Pak Watch Society from 2005 to 2010. He also worked as Deputy Secretary of National Security Council Secretariat with Government of India from 2000 to 2001. His publications include 3 books. 1. Nuclear South Asia Keywords and Concepts, co-author with Atul Mishra. 2. Fighting Like a Guerrilla, the Indian Army and Counter-Insurgency. And 3. Second Strike, Arguments about Nuclear War in South Asia. Our third speaker is Dr. Adil Sultan. Dr. Adil Sultan is Dean and Head of the Department of Faculty of Aerospace Sciences and Strategic Studies at Air University, Islamabad. He has served in Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division for over 14 years and majorly worked on arms control and disarmament related issues. Before joining Air University, Dr. Sultan was working as director at the Center for Airspace and Security Studies in Islamabad. From 2017 to 2019, Dr. Sultan was working as a visiting research fellow with the Department of War Studies at King's College London. During his fellowship at King's College, he published a book titled Universalizing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Norms, a regional framework for South Asian nuclear weapon states. Dr. Sultan also worked with International Institute for Strategic Studies London and Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. as the visiting research fellow. He is co-founder for a web portal named Strategic Foresight for Asia. Our last speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Mansoor Ahmad. Dr. Mansoor Ahmad is a senior research fellow at Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad. He was a Stenton Junior Faculty Fellow and a postdoctoral research fellow with International Security Program and the managing the Atom Project at Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School from 2015 to 2018. He also served as a lecturer in Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, from 2011 to 2015, and as visiting faculty in Department of Strategic and Nuclear Studies, National Defense University, Islamabad, from 2009 to 2011. Before joining the academia, he worked in Pakistan Audit and Accounts Service from July 2003 to January 2011. Dr. Ahmed holds a PhD in International Relations from Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. His research interests include various aspects of Pakistani and Indian nuclear programs and policies, fissile material, non-proliferation, arms control, and strategic stability issues, with specific reference to South Asia. His research work has been published by the Belfer Center, the Stimson Center, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. As introduced, we have a worthy list of experts on strategic affairs in today's session. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to speak on the subject, and all attendees are welcomed to write their questions in Q&A and chat box. Now, Dr. Salih will speak on India's Space and Missile Program, a Pakistani assessment. Over to you, sir. Sir, please unmute your mic, please.
Thank you, Afira. As we know that India has a very extensive space as well as missile program. It is nothing new. The ambassador mentioned about the 2004 next steps in strategic partnership between US and India. And one of the steps in strategic partnership was, of course, cooperation in the civilian space research. And as a result of that, most of the entities associated with India's Space Research Organization, which were previously on the entity list of US Commerce Department, they were removed from that and allowed to have commerce related to the space technology from the United States. However, we know that space technology is something which has got multiple uses. Even a space capability which is purely meant for the civilian purposes can also very easily be modified for military purposes. India's space program started in 1967 in earnest, and in fact, Pakistan's space program predates India's space program by a couple of years. But unfortunately, it did not get enough attention or the allocation of resources. Therefore, the Pakistani program lagged behind, and it is now trying to catch up, but there's a big gap which has been created in the meantime. Uh, India, in the beginning, sent some of its scientists for training in the US, and that group of scientists included Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, who also underwent training in the United States and had opportunity to visit NASA and get useful information about the space exploration from there. And then once he came back, he set up the Space Research Organization. But actual boost to the Indian space program was given by uh, what we know as the Sarabhai profile. This was the 10-year program, development program, announced in early 1970s by Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, who was Secretary of Indian Department of Energy and Indian a chairman of Indian Atomic Energy Commission. Uh, India, as we know, had conducted its first nuclear test in 1974. But unlike 1998, it did not declare itself as a nuclear weapon state at that time. And in my view, I think one of the major reasons, uh, other than any political diplomatic considerations, was the reason that India did not have any appropriate delivery system for its nuclear weapons, except some old vintage camera bombers, which had a very limited range and payload capacity. But otherwise, there were no delivery systems, and that is why India refrained from declaring itself as a nuclear weapon state, because then it would have been counterproductive and could have got uh, some counter reactions from maybe China or some other countries. So it was held back. And then the focus shifted from the nuclear program to the space program, which had two things, two elements. One was the surveillance and intelligence communication systems, which would ultimately become part of the command and control system, and also provide India with the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, which are essentially needed for target acquisition. It also then was linked up with the missile program, because the rocket technology, which is used for launching of satellites, is also the same, which with little modification can also be used for missile purposes. So that was the focus of the Sarabhai profile. It combined basically the developments in the space and nuclear programs, and they went parallel from there onwards. Uh, as far as the space program is concerned, India started developing the space launch vehicles, SLVs, and then the augmented SLV in the early 1980s, but they had limited payload carrying capability and could not launch bigger satellites or bigger loads into space. And they were also, because of technical glitches, there were a lot of failures in those tests. And finally, both these programs, SLV and ASLV, they were discarded. And then India started the what we call the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicles (PSLV) program, and later on also the GLSV, the Geosynchronous Launch Vehicle program. Now, PSLV has been a very successful program as far as India's space program is concerned. It has a four-stage rocket, and it can carry up to 1,600 kilogram of payload into space. Basically, it is for low Earth orbits, and it has been the workhorse of India's space program. It has also been used for commercial purposes, for launching satellites for other countries. And then it has up to May 2019, it had almost 50 missions, 50 launches, you can say, and that included the mission to the moon and also the Mars orbiter. So this has been a major success story. GSLV had some teething problems in the beginning, and initially there were some unsuccessful attempts, but later on this program has also matured. Now India has the capability to launch satellites both in low Earth orbits as well as in the geosynchronous orbits. And India can boast of being the uh, country which has got the largest fleet of remote sensing and communication satellites in the Asia region, which is quite an achievement. But then to further add technical sophistication into the program, the agreement with the United States in the 2004 NSSP, what we discussed earlier also, uh, has opened up new avenues for India to further expand its space program. And we have seen the manifestations of that in recent years. Last year, on 27th of March, India conducted its first anti-satellite test. So it joined the exclusive club of 4 countries which have tested this technology, including United States, Russia, China, and India now is the 4th member. And it is generally believed that India's anti-sat test was in response to China's similar test in 2007. And since India has got a lot of space assets, it probably felt threatened by China's capability to launch anti-satellite vehicles. So therefore, to deter any kind of offensive action against India's space assets, India also demonstrated its capability for similar kind of tests. Although this was a kinetic kill test uh, launched in controlled environment because it hit one of India's own satellites which were launched a couple of months earlier than this test. The earlier attempt, first attempt in February 2019 was a failure, but in the March attempt succeeded. And the timing is also very important because other than the technological imperatives, it also had a domestic political angle because it came very close to the Indian national elections, which were to be held in May 2019. Uh, Obviously, the ruling party gained political dividends out of the success of this test. However, there are other means, as people say, that the kinetic kill capability is now an old technology, and the latest now thinking is to particularly to avoid causing space debris, which can cause dangers for the other satellites which are moving in close by orbits. Now the focus is shifting towards laser and other electronic means to jam the satellite signals. But as I said, India has now extensive space capability, and it's growing day by day. So it has got a variety of capabilities for communication, for remote sensing. It has recently launched the Cartosat 1 and 2, which have got very good resolution. Cartosat 1 had about 3 meters or so of resolution, and Cartosat 2 has about 1 meter resolution, which are very useful for military purposes and can provide real-time surveillance of any movement of Pakistan or Chinese strategic forces. So this was the space program, and obviously, once you have the capability to launch PSLVs and GSLVs, then it is not very difficult to convert that capability into some kind of ICBM or intermediate range missile capability. So these are complementary. Similarly, we have seen that India had started its ballistic missile defense program in the mid 1990s, uh, and part of that program, the Prithvi defense system, which was one of the interceptors of the BMD program, was modified and used as the anti-sat weapon. So there is a complementarity of systems which can be transferred. Technology can be modified and transferred from one to the other, from space to the BMD, from space to the missile program as well. As far as India's missile program is concerned, initially it began with the reverse engineering of the Russian origin surface to air missile SA 2, and this was converted into Prithvi Missile. It was a liquid fuel missile with a range of 150 kilometers. The testing of that missile started in 1988, and in 1989, the Indians tested the intermediate range missile Agni, which was a 1500 kilometer range two-stage missile with one liquid fuel and one solid fuel stage. Although this wasn't a very successful experiment, the first test was successful, but then the subsequent two tests were failure, and then this program was frozen uh, until 1989, once the program was resumed. Uh, India has also shown ambitions by announcing that it is going to send a manned mission to moon in 2022, coinciding with the 75th Independence Day of India. It has established a defense space agency, and it is in the process of setting up a defense space research organization similar to something the space version of the DRDO. It is also planning for some time to establish an aerospace command, which will probably be under the aegis of the Indian Air Force, and that will be a center which will control the data communication and intelligence data being provided by all satellites, particularly with those with the military applications. Uh, it has also established a technology cell in Ministry of Home Affairs to benefit from the images being available from these Indian satellites, the remote sensing and surveillance satellites to help control the borders. India, besides the United States, India has also got cooperation in the space field from Australia, Japan, and France. So coming back to the missile program, uh, the missile program was actually uh, started in 1983 in the form of what was called the Integrated Guided Missile Development Program. The program was aimed at developing five kinds of missiles, uh, two with strategic implications, the Prithvi and the short range Prithvi and the medium range Agni missile. And the other three missiles two were surface to air missiles, one short range Trishul and the other medium range Akash, and the fifth one was the anti tank missile. But from our purpose, the two most important missiles in this category were the Prithvi and Agni missiles. And this program continued for 25 years and until it was uh, formally and wound up in 2008 after the launch of Agni 3 missile with 3,000 to 3,500 kilometer of range. Uh, the Prithvi Test, as I mentioned, started in 1988, and there were 15 to 16 tests before it was inducted into the Indian Army. There were two longer range versions. Also, the original Army version was a 150 kilometer range with a 1,000 kilogram payload. Therefore, it was clearly a nuclear capable missile. The other one was the 250 kilometer range. It was the Air Force version, and this was acquired by the Indian Air Force to be used for interdiction of Pakistani air bases and installations. It was ground-based missile. It was not air-launched missile system. The third one was the uh, Dhanush or the Prithvi 3 missile, which is with a range of 350 kilometers. This was the naval version. Again, a unique experiment because generally on the naval platforms, cruise missiles are employed because the thrust of the ballistic missile launch can crash the top deck of the ships. So therefore, they have to be reinforced before these can be used for this purpose. So the specially designed and reinforced decks of the ships were prepared for this kind of missile launch. But interestingly, this was a liquid fuel missile, obviously, which cannot remain filled, and the containers for the fuel, liquid fuel, had to be stored on the ships with all the attendant dangers of leakage of the very toxic fuel, as well as the vapors from there, which could be very harmful to the crews. But this still experiment is going on. But I believe, given its limited range and the other technical problems, this may be abandoned, because now Indians have got other sea-based capabilities, and this may not be as useful as it was probably as a stopgap arrangement. Uh, India has also fielded longer range versions of Agni, the Agni 2, which is 2000 kilometer range. Then Agni 3, as I said, 3000 to 3500 kilometers. Agni 4, which is 2500 to 3700 kilometers. Now, these ranges are in a broad band, because you can always have this uh, change in the payload, and if you reduce the payload, it will range further. If you increase the payload, the same missile will range to a lesser distance. Uh, the Agni 5 is an ICBM category missile with 5,000 to 8,000 kilometer range, and Agni 6, which is likely to have a range of 10,000 to 12,000 kilometers, is still in the development stage. Then there are the K series of missiles. In that series, two missiles have already been fielded. One is K-15, which has got a 700 kilometer range. It is an SLBM, which can carry a 1,000 kilogram payload. The other is K-4, which has got 3,500 kilometer range, and it can carry 1 to 2 tons of payload. The third one, K5, which is the longest in this category, which is its ICBM range, 6,000 kilometer missile. It is still in development and testing stage. So that will be some time before it can be launched. But the K15 and K4 are already available to be installed on India's submarines, and probably K15 has already been deployed on the Arihant submarine. There is another missile which has recently been tested by the name of Surya. This is short to medium range missile, which is supposed to be hypersonic missile. And as its test, after the test, the declaration was that this is a technology demonstrator. So obviously, it will be some time before it will mature and be ready for induction into the Indian military. There are short-range missiles like the short-range tactical ballistic missile Prahar with a 150 kilometer range. It has got sufficient payload to be used as a nuclear delivery system, although Indians have never pronounced it to be a nuclear delivery system, but probably my assessment is that this will replace the aging Prithvi 1 missile of 150 kilometer range. So Prahar will probably replace the Prithvis, which are due for retirement now. There are two other versions of Prahar. One is Pragati, which is 170 kilometers, an export version, and then is Pranash with a 200 kilometer range. Probably that is still in the experimental stage. Then there is this Nirbe, which is uh, a long range subsonic missile with zero point 0.6 to zero point 0.8 Mach speed. It has got a range of 700 kilometers, and this is still under development, but this is uh, supposed to be a nuclear delivery missile. Uh, India already had the cruise missile BrahMos, which was first introduced in 2002. This is basically a joint venture of India and Russia, and the major contribution in that is the Russian technology. Indian just provided the guidance system and maybe the body paint of the missile, but it is all in all basically a Russian origin missile. It was announced to be a missile with a 290 kilometer range, uh, just to, I think, avoid the MTCR strictures. But since India has now joined the MTCR, it has emboldened India and Russia to go for a longer range BrahMos. It's a supersonic missile, and now the next advanced version of this is going to have 500 kilometer of range with supersonic speed. These they have already been installed on Su-30 aircraft. It is also ground launched, and it has been there on the Indian naval platforms as well. So this is a very versatile system, and it is the only missile of its kind because of its supersonic speed. And then probably the next will be new generation of BrahMos missile with 600 kilometer of range. This missile has also been offered for export, and there was recently a news that uh, Philippines probably may be the first potential buyer of this missile. Now, this gives us an idea that India has got a variety of missiles of different types of cruise and ballistic missile, from short range to the ICBM range, from SLBMs to the surface missiles to air launched missiles. So there's a whole package. And in the last month or so, we have seen that there has been a feverish pitch of testing of missiles. I think there were at least 10 to 12 missile tests during the last 2 3 weeks, and this shows that India is going full speed ahead. I don't know what was the purpose of this accelerated testing program. Maybe the background was the ongoing tensions with China in Ladakh region, and probably was meant to send some messages to China. It was we all know that missile tests are also one of the means of signaling. So this could well be signaling to China, but it also shows that newer systems are also being introduced and being tested, uh, including one system which was supposed to be a hypersonic system to carry and launch a torpedo at 650 kilometers range. So that had maritime capability. So it shows the newer areas in which the Indian missile program is going. And finally, just briefly about India's BMD program. We started in the mid 1990s, and the first test was carried out in 2006, and then there have been subsequent follow-on tests. It has got two kind of interceptors. One is the Prithvi Air Defense Interceptor, which is a high altitude interceptor, which is in the higher altitude of the Earth's atmosphere, from 80 to 100 kilometers, probably just staying outside the space, and uh, that makes it an endo-atmospheric interceptor. The other one is the advanced or Ashwin air defense system, that is a low altitude, 20 to 40 kilometer altitude missile, which is just to intercept the incoming missile at the very last stages of its re-entry. The third major system which India has signed a deal with Russia is the S-400 missile system, which is basically an air defense system with some inherent potential for missile defense also. But given its longest range missile, which had got a slant range of 400 kilometers, but only 30 kilometer altitude, it shows that it may be good enough against short range missiles or the very final stages of incoming missiles. At that time, I think that's a very narrow window to attempt a missile interception, but it has some potential, although its capabilities have been anticipated and it is yet to be tested in actual battle conditions. So its performance is yet to be determined. It has not been tested anywhere in the world as yet, unlike S-300 and other Russian systems. India has also got some support in the missile defense program from the US since its support of the NMD program in May 2001. The Indians have been invited to witness the missile defense test in US. They have also attended tabletop exercises, and they have got some insight into the BMD technology. There is some cooperation there. The US even offered to sell the Patriot 2 system to India, but Indians probably prefer to have Patriot 3, or the Arrow system from Israel, which again was not cleared by the US. But then India has acquired Arrow associated green pine radar from Israel. It has also developed swordfish radar to support its BMD program with the assistance from France and Israel. And there is also continuous support from the Russians. So this is, I think, in this short time, I have tried to give you a very quick overview of the extent of India's space and missile program, which has been very extensive and obviously requires a much greater time to explain all the technical details. But suffice it to say that India is one of the select countries in the world which have got this vast capability. There is always, remember that although some of Indian analysts always mention the missile threat from Pakistan and China as the main motivating source for India's burgeoning missile program, uh, but it has to be remembered that India's missile program predates Pakistan's missile program, and Pakistan had also at one stage offered a zero missile regime during Benazir's first government, but Indians did not take up that proposal. And we also know that in all such programs, both space and missile, like India's nuclear program, the prestige issue is also very prominent consideration, because India wants to place itself as one of the uh, most advanced, technologically advanced countries in the world. And many Indian analysts argue that these kind of technological capabilities would improve India's credentials to sit on the international high table, and so that it could have a effective voice in deciding on the international policies on these issues. So I end here, and I'll take up any questions once we come over to the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salith, for your very comprehensive presentation. Now, I will request our second speaker, Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan. Dr. Rajesh will give his views on India's missiles and nuclear program and Indian perspective. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking CISS and Ambassador Nakhvi for inviting me to this meeting. So what, since we're talking about strategic stability, I'll try and make about 5 or 6 points broadly about strategic stability in the region and how India's missile and nuclear programs fit within that, and what the impact is specifically in terms of the US-India strategic partnership that has been developing over the last 2 decades. So I would argue that strategic stability is a function of 2 factors, both capabilities that that Dr. Salik very ably pointed out the various capabilities, but it is also a function of behavior. So we can't just look at capabilities alone, and I would suggest that we need to look at both capabilities and behavior when you look at strategic stability in the region. Now, these are not unrelated, obviously. Capabilities can limit or encourage certain behavior, and that can, but behavior can also, especially presumed aggressiveness of adversaries, so on and so forth, can also drive capabilities, drive the desire to acquire particular capabilities. So we have to look at both, in other words, and behavior is an important driver of strategic stability. And this is not something new, because we have a significant amount of literature going back to Stephen Wald's examination of balance of threat. And balance of threat, obviously, when he talks about threat encompasses both capability or relative power, but also perception of threat. But perception of threat is potentially based on the behavior of other countries, of potential adversaries, and so on. And there is a not just Steve Wald, but there is also a significant amount of subsequent literature that looks at the impact of behavior on actual relations, and on a variety of areas, but definitely on strategic stability also, that behavior would matter. So I'm not suggesting that capabilities don't matter, but capabilities matter, relative capabilities matter. Strength and weaknesses is an important factor for strategic stability, because weakness, of course, can lead to insecurity, and relative weakness can lead to insecurity, and insecurity is obviously an important driver of state behavior. So that part I'm not ignoring, but I would suggest that we need to look at both capabilities and behavior. So I'll briefly talk about behavior, and then I'll sort of come to the specifics of Indian capabilities and the impact that U.S.-India strategic partnership has had on Indian capabilities. The first, when we talk about strategic stability in South Asia, we have to talk about a key factor, which is that most of the crisis over the last 2 decades has been the consequence of various incidents, terrorist incidents that India blames on Pakistan, that clearly Pakistan has used terror as a strategy, which becomes an important, which has been an important problem when we look at strategic stability. I mean, we are this is the anniversary of the 2008 Mumbai terror attack. So obviously that is an important variable, important factor from an Indian perspective about what leads to strategic stability. Now, every major crisis in the last 20 years, I'm going back to after the nuclear test, 1998, whether it's Kargil or the Parliament attack, Operation Parakram, and so on and so forth, has had at its root terror attacks against India that come from Pakistan. So that is an important factor that we need to consider. That behavior is an important factor that we need to consider when we look at strategic stability. Now, Paul Kapoor has an excellent book on jihad as grand strategy, where he's shown that using terror as a strategy has brought some benefits to Pakistan, in terms of it being an asymmetric capability particularly for a weaker country. But overall, he argues, and I would agree with him, that it's been much more harmful to Pakistan's strategic situation, because it also forces India to increase military spending and capabilities, and that, in a sense, rebounds is a classic security dilemma, because the more fearful India becomes of these kinds of asymmetric attacks, the greater Indian spending on its security becomes, and the less trust it has, and so that leads to that sort of lack of trust then leads to strategic instability by increasing political competition, by intensifying the arms race, leading to tensions and crises. And so we have a whole history of the last 2 decades. I don't think we need to go into that, but that illustrates that factor very, very clearly. So in a sense, we can't ignore that part of strategic stability. The other side of the equation is, of course, capabilities, as Dr. correctly pointed out. Capabilities, if you look at Indian capabilities, but specifically its nuclear and missile capabilities, I would broadly argue that Indian capabilities have actually grown very slowly. It is true that India has a large missile program, or but when you talk about all the way from Prithvi to Agni and whatnot, that is obviously legacy programs, and so it's been IGMTP started in the mid 80s, so it's been about close to 4 decades since that program started. Even though now it is finished, but it's been a very long program, and so obviously a number of missiles and missile capabilities have sort of been part of that. So 5 quick points that I'll make on this, since given the limited amount of time. The first point that I would say is that to the extent that US-India strategic partnership has affected India's missile and nuclear capabilities, it has primarily been, it has actually limited Indian capabilities. And I'll 2 parts to this argument. One is that the US-India strategic partnership itself has grown. I mean, there is no, I mean, I wouldn't, there is no 2 ways about it. India and US have expanded their strategic partnership, primarily driven by Chinese aggression, as well as China's rise. I and others in India have argued that it should have, the US-India partnership should have gone faster and should have gone closer. I mean, but it is what it is, and so that relationship has clearly become fairly solid, even though, like me, me and a lot of others who are not entirely satisfied at the state of the relationship. We think it should be even closer. So, but the second part of that, so the first part in terms of the closeness, growing closeness, there is no doubt, there is no question about it. The second part, in terms of its effect on strategic stability, I would argue that's generally been positive, because India has wanted closer ties and benefits from the United States. India did not want to hurt that prospect by worrying the United States with a large nuclear program or a large missile program. So India has been very concerned since 1998 about presenting itself as a responsible nuclear actor. And so if you look at the 1999 draft nuclear doctrine, the draft nuclear doctrine talked about triad, and that immediately caused concern in the United States about India's plans, and therefore the draft nuclear doctrine remained a draft. I mean, it was the Indian government disowned it, even though, of course, ultimately we did build a triad. But the point is that, my point is simply that it was India has been very concerned about giving an impression of being of having a large nuclear or missile program. So India similarly has politically limited missile testing and development, again because it was seen as potentially damaging at various points, and India's DRDO and other organizations have complained about the fact that they are not being allowed to test. So the most recent series of tests that both Dr. Salik and Dr. Ambassador Nakhvi pointed out is actually an illustration of that part, that it seems to have slightly removed that political restrictions on these tests, and so we have lot many more tests over the last 2 months. So, but that also indicates that there has been a lot of political control over those tests. So, in a sense, the point I'm making is that the US-India strategic partnership has actually led to a limitation in terms of Indian capabilities, rather than encourage further Indian capabilities. The second point that I'd make is that the growth in India's nuclear arsenals, warheads, particularly in terms of the not missile, but the nuclear warheads capabilities, have been extremely slow, steady, but very, very slow. By all open source calculations, India actually has a smaller number of nuclear warheads than even Pakistan. I say even Pakistan, not because Pakistan is, only because Pakistan obviously is a smaller country, only faces, only has India as its primary adversary, whereas India has both Pakistan and China. Though despite that, India has actually smaller number of nuclear warheads, and India does have larger reserve of missile stocks, but this is the expectation is that this is being kept for India's fast breeder reactors, and therefore it won't be available for warheads. I mean, of course, it can be if India needs to be. Obviously, it can, but it is India has not built the number of warheads that that Pakistan has, for example, and that smaller number is particularly surprising because every year there are at least 1 or 2 reports sometime during the year that comes out saying Pakistan has more warheads than India has, and from CIPRI or from IISS or somewhere or the other, and there is zero response from India, because then the zero response on the official level and no real concern at the popular level either, in terms of the strategic community. Partly because I don't think India bothers too much about the fact either at the, I mean, there are a few people in the strategic community who may want much larger arsenals and so on and so forth, but at the official level and amongst the vast majority of the Indian strategic community, there is no concern about the fact that Pakistan has a few more warheads. I mean, that is not an issue for India, because I'll come to the because part of it in a bit, but that tells you something about the growth or the lack of growth in India's nuclear capability. So that is one aspect, and this is, like I said, this is particularly surprising considering that India has two adversaries potentially in both Pakistan and China, and therefore that it has to divide its forces between these two. The third point, when we not just warhead, but also if you look at the missile delivery capabilities, again, Indian missile development programs have been steady, but again extremely slow. It's been almost, like I said, 4 decades since the IGMTP began, but it is only now maybe beginning to feel, if Indian press reports are to be believed, beginning to deploy the first ICBMs, Agni 5. Just to sort of give you a comparison that all of you know, which is that the US and the Soviet Union took less than a decade in terms of developing their first ICBM from the time they actively pursued a missile program in the post-Second World War period. So, and this, of course, they were starting with a much smaller technological base and starting with a much lower levels of technology. And so, clearly, and other countries have been the same. I mean, no country takes 40 years to develop ICBMs once they put their minds to it, especially large countries like India. So, so clearly, if you look at the Indian missile development program, that again has been extremely slow. And again, if you look at the comparison to Pakistan actually has more. If you look at the latest military balance, IISS in 2020, Pakistan actually has more ballistic missiles when you combine the SRBMs and MRBMs than India has. A small number, but definitely more than India has. And if you compare other NRDC nuclear notebook and things like that, again, that's very, very clear across the board. There is no doubt on the fact that India clearly does not have more missiles than even Pakistan has, for let alone China. So so when you talk about the growth part of it, I think we need to keep those numbers in mind. The fourth point that I would make is about the fact that why this slow development of capabilities and why this lack of concern with numbers. I think the reason is fairly straightforward, because India sees nuclear weapons as playing a very limited role in its military strategy. Nuclear weapons, India sees as only useful in deterring other nuclear weapons, and therefore there is not any the nuclear weapons don't play any military role outside of just nuclear deterrence. And so India doesn't require nuclear weapons to play a role in conventional deterrence, in deterring conventional attacks. So because India has a fairly large conventional military force, and it has it is itself a large country and a reasonably strong country, and it can defend itself with conventional weapons, and it faces no existential threats. I mean, countries that face existential threats potentially have to worry about the balance and have to worry about how they will use nuclear weapons. But India does not have those worries, and therefore I'm not going down the moral path that a lot of many Indian academics or strategy community members might argue. I'm not saying this is India's slow development is not because of any moral or ethical reasons. It's primarily because India doesn't really require a very large nuclear force. But that nevertheless that remains the case, that India does not have. India's development has been fairly slow and steady, slower than it's steady but very, very slow. And so what we have still is a nuclear force that is, both in terms of warheads as well as in missiles, smaller than Pakistan's, despite the fact that India has two adversaries to deal with. The fifth point that I'd make is about the conventional imbalance, and I think that's fair enough. I mean, India, India does have a larger conventional military than Pakistan has, and I can understand how that might be potentially be worrying for Pakistan. But it also has to be kept in mind that India does have, again, ground two adversaries or two countries with which it has serious problems on the borders. I mean, so not just Pakistan, but also on the other side, China. So 10 infantry divisions are basically devoted to the northern border, to the Tibet border. So in a sense, when you take into account that India has to have a separate army almost for dealing with the northern border, then it does not seem that large. But also, it also is that to some extent that imbalance can't really be helped because India obviously has an economy 7-8 times larger than Pakistan's, and so it is only natural that it will spend more, even proportionately speaking. And India has always spent proportionately smaller than Pakistan has. Again, for understandable reasons. I'm not saying that this is a great mystery, but the point is that that does bring in India a larger, helps India build a larger military force, and allows India to have a much larger force despite a smaller proportion of money being spent. But it's also that, I mean, India faced the same problem of imbalance with China, but Indian response to China has been primarily been defensive, not offensive. And so, we've attempted to build political, diplomatic, economic, and even military links. We've had military exercises until last year with China, all in an effort to build that strategic stability, even on the other side, not just with Pakistan, but on the other side. That the fact that obviously the last few months demonstrates that none of that effort has succeeded. Notwithstanding, I think the point is that strategic stability does require more. Even when you have an imbalance, engaging in rather offensive operations, or not operations, but offensive sort of strategies doesn't really help. So what India's response to that same sort of imbalance that Pakistan has vis-a-vis India has been more defensive rather than offensive, and its failure is not really does not really obviate that part. A final point is in terms of where does this all go? What of the future? How will India capability develop? I mean, I know there have been arguments from some good friends in the US about India moving towards counterforce and things like that. But I wrote a fairly, not sort of toot my own horn, but I wrote a fairly long rebuttal to that argument about India's counterforce. I mean, I find it difficult to believe that India will go down the path of counterforce, considering that India has a smaller arsenal than Pakistan has. So it makes no sense. I mean, to have a counterforce doctrine would require India to have a nuclear force that is several times Pakistan's size, in terms of the size of the nuclear force at least. So I would expect that India's nuclear and missile development will continue, that it would continue to grow. For the simple reason that even 20 years after the 1998 nuclear test, and close to 40 years after the IGBMD started, we are just now beginning to deploy the first missile that is potentially capable of targeting a significant chunk of China. And even that, depending on the range, I know there are problems, the questions about range and whatnot, but we probably need to have a missile with an even longer range to be able to cover all of Chinese territory from southern India. We can't obviously put it, as some have suggested, putting it in Assam is not really particularly sensible. And again, as Dr. Salik mentioned, the SLBMs are of useless as far as the range goes, because they are of such low range. Even the next one that we are going to get is of such low range that again will have to continually develop, have missiles of much longer range. So the requirements are such that it will develop, it will continue to develop, it will continue to grow. But I would expect that would be at the same way that it has been for the last 2 decades. Slow, steady but very, very slow. And so I would, and no great change in terms of the in terms of nuclear doctrine, because that would remain NFU and minimum doctrine, and so we will continue to have a small nuclear force. Let me stop here. I'm happy to sort of take questions in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Now I would like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Adil Sultan, to speak on the US-India Foundational Agreements and India's emerging capabilities. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Afira. Thank you to CISS team and Ambassador Nakhvi especially, sir. You are providing opportunity to meet us through virtual socializing. I think these are very important events. More importantly, these are good, as we were discussing before we started the session, it is very beneficial for the students who want to benefit from these, because the class learning or teaching has become really challenging in these times. So these webinars are very useful. I was tempted to respond to Dr. Rajesh, some of the assertions like India has a much smaller nuclear inventory and still India is not worried about Pakistan's nuclear capability. But I'll leave it to Dr. Mansoor. Probably he will be addressing those issues. And since we have limited time left, so I'll focus on my topic, which was allotted, the India-US Foundational Agreements and India's emerging capabilities. India and US have recently signed this Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, BICA, that is generally known during the recently concluded 2+2 dialogue, which is the last of the 4 foundational agreements that will enable India to access information gathered from the US satellites and use the advanced navigational aids on the US supplied platforms. The other 3 agreements that India has signed with the US include General Security of Military Information Agreement, and that was signed in 2002, Logistics Exchange Memorandum Agreement LIMOA in 2016, and Communication Compatibility and Security Arrangement, generally known as COMCASA, in 2018. These agreements, together with the growing strategic partnership between the 2 countries, is likely to significantly enhance India's military potential. India claims that this buildup is necessary to counter the perceived, I say perceived, Chinese threat and to fight a 2-front war with both Pakistan and China. India, however, is unlikely to embroil itself in a major military conflict with China, as was evident from the recent Ladakh skirmishes, which leaves the only possibility of India's military potential being used against its principal adversary, that is Pakistan, in a future military crisis. It is therefore not difficult to comprehend why Pakistan has signaled its discomfort when India and United States signed BICA agreement recently, which would help improve India's military situational awareness and preparedness for planning precision strikes against Pakistan. These concerns become more relevant keeping in view India's evolving posture of preemptive counterforce strikes. Now, just giving a brief background, from NSSP, Next Steps in Strategic Partnership, that Brigadier Salik also mentioned, that was concluded in 2003, to the conclusion of BICA in 2020. What was the roadmap? India and United States agreed on a roadmap that could have helped the former build its military potential and the stature of a credible regional power to help counter the growing Chinese influence in the region. That was the stated objective. The next steps in strategic partnership that was agreed between the 2 countries in 2004 provided the basis for expanding the bilateral engagements in the field of space, civil nuclear energy, and dual-use sensitive technology. The joint statement of July 18, 2005 provided a future framework for building a strategic partnership and included commitment to build closer ties in space exploration, satellite navigation, and satellite launch. The most vital component of strategic partnership was the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement that offered unprecedented concessions to India, allowing it to keep at least 8 out of the 22 facilities outside the International Atomic Energy Agency's safeguards, and these were to be used purely for military purposes. The Nuclear Cooperation Agreement would not have been possible without the United States amending its own domestic laws that prohibited nuclear cooperation with a non-NPT state. Not only this was achieved to benefit India, but the US also coerced the 48 members nuclear suppliers group to grant India specific exemptions from the group's export control guideline so that India could engage in civil nuclear trade with the rest of the members of the NSG. The United States is pushing the NSG members to make another exemption and allow India to become formal member of the NSG. Interestingly, the NSG that came into existence as a consequence of India's decision to divert civil nuclear technology for military purposes is now being asked to accommodate the same country that is the reason for the group's very existence. The US has also paved way for India's entry into the 3 other export control regimes, which include the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Australia Group, and the Wassenaar Arrangement. This allows India to access sensitive dual-use technology with relative ease and use it for military purposes without much difficulty. Interestingly, when India and the United States were negotiating the nuclear civil cooperation agreement in 2005 and 6, the BJP was in opposition and had strongly opposed the strategic partnership, accusing the then Indian government of a sellout and compromising on India's strategic autonomy. Almost after 15 years, the same BJP is now championing the strategic partnership and forging new agreements that may formally integrate India into the US-led military alliance. And as a result of these arrangements, India may no longer be as autonomous as it wanted to be. Briefly about what is BICA. The technical details and the scope of this agreement are unlikely to be made public, but this agreement will facilitate exchange of geospatial information between the United States Department of Defense, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and India's Ministry of Defense, thus allowing both countries to share military information, including advanced satellite and topographic data such as maps, etc. The data gathered by the United States as a result of this new agreement is unlikely to be shared with a third party due to the confidentiality clause that was inserted to pacify India's concerns about the possibility of US sharing information about the Indian military installations or facilities with Pakistan. The excitement within India over the recently concluded BICA and its associated benefits projected to be a potential game changer as we continue to read literature from India. This may have inadvertently exposed the inadequacy of India's existing surveillance and information gathering infrastructure that includes its space-based assets as well as airborne platforms that are acquired from different sources. India that has been projecting itself to be a space power with a demonstrated capability to shoot down adversaries' satellites was apparently lacking the requisite technology to emerge as a real aerospace power. The new agreement, besides facilitating the exchange of data, will allow India to acquire advanced navigational aids and avionics that could be used on the US-supplied aircraft and drones. India at present is operating 9 US-supplied P-8I long-range surveillance aircraft and is likely to acquire another 9 in the near future. The conclusion of BICA has also enabled India to lease 2 Predator drones from the United States that are now being operated by the Indian Navy. These drones could also be used along the line of control to gather geospatial data and to plan precision strikes inside Pakistan. This data could be useful to improve accuracy of India's cruise and ballistic missiles that may be necessary if India contemplates preemptive counter-force strikes against Pakistan in the future. And why I continue to say this contemplating of preemptive strikes, because several Indian leadership, they have been indicating about this possible shift or potential shift in India's nuclear doctrine and possibility of a preemptive counter-force strike against Pakistan. Now, what are the implications for the region? The US-India Comprehensive Global Partnership, as they say, is likely to enhance India's political standing at the international level, besides helping the current BJP leadership to restore its credibility at the domestic front. And why I say credibility, what we saw during 2019 crisis and during the recent skirmishes at the LSE also, BJP's credibility has been questioned the way they were projecting or flaunting against Pakistan. So besides signing the 4 foundational agreements, India and the United States have also agreed to review their bilateral military-to-military engagements, which would include holding of joint military exercises, training, and expert exchanges. These developments are being viewed with concern by India's neighbors. China has already dismissed these efforts as a show-off and an effort to intimidate China. whereas Pakistan sees these developments as a threat to regional stability and which needs to be countered to ensure strategic stability in the region. India has also recently tested hypersonic technology demonstrator vehicle HTDV that would be able to carry hypersonic cruise missiles with speeds more than Mach 7 and hit the targets with greater accuracy. Hypersonic weapons, due to their short flight time, could also be useful against mobile launchers such as the Nasr missile system that Pakistan is likely to employ as part of its full spectrum deterrence posture to deter India's limited war-fighting doctrine of cold start or proactive operation strategy. India can also utilize the information acquired from the US satellites and other surveillance equipment as a result of new arrangements for its drone strikes across the LOC or inside mainland Pakistan. This could be used to help reduce the risk of a manned aerial surgical strikes without putting the credibility of its air force at risk, as was evident in 2019 Balakot crisis. Now, what are the options for Pakistan? Notwithstanding the adverse implications of the growing India-US strategic partnership on the regional stability, this should not be seen as a zero-sum game. Pakistan must resist the temptations and should not signal that it is willing to join any anti-US alliance to address its India-specific threat perceptions, mainly for two reasons. One, the new Cold War, if at all we label it as a new Cold War, is unlikely to be similar to what we saw as a result of Soviet-US military alliances. And secondly, neither the United States is going to fight a war with China on behalf of India, nor China would like to engage in a military conflict with India or the United States on behalf of Pakistan. Pakistan therefore should continue to evaluate its India-specific threat perception and take measures that could ensure the credibility of its deterrence posture to help prevent a major conflict with India. Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence posture so far has helped achieve this objective, but India's growing space-based capabilities, together with its evolving doctrinal thinking, which includes the possibility of counterforce strike, may push Pakistan to review its security perception vis-a-vis India. By testing an anti-satellite weapon, India has already demonstrated its military prowess in the space. In response, Pakistan would need to develop options that may not necessarily be in the form of developing a matching capability in the short term, but in the long term, definitely this aspect has to be thought. But what Pakistan needs to do is, whatever the threat perceptions it feels, it needs to take what actions are immediately required to balance that. But this would require resources and access to technologies that are not readily available for countries like Pakistan, mainly for political reasons. To arrest the growing gap in the space domain, Pakistan could also explore expanding its space cooperation with China. Both Pakistan and China are already working on their 8-year plan between China National Space Administration and Space and Upper Atmosphere Research Commission, that is SPARCO from Pakistan. As part of this arrangement, China is committed to launch communications and Earth observation satellites for Pakistan. This cooperation, nevertheless, needs to be further expanded, focusing more on the civilian applications, so as to bridge the gap as early as possible. Since the developments in the civilian sphere outpace the military developments around the globe, and also keeping into consideration the fact that technologically advanced countries like the United States are outsourcing their projects to tech giants instead of establishing their military-focused infrastructure, it is imperative that Pakistan should also focus on more civilian applications of space technology, which would invariably have associated military dividends. Finally, while the new US administration is unlikely to fundamentally alter its approach towards China and India, but it is expected that it will not be as unpredictable as the previous one, and would be relatively more sensitive to the impact of growing military imbalance in the region. Pakistan must therefore continue to remain engaged with the new US administration and continue to highlight the negative implications of the growing India-US military collaboration on the regional stability. Since the US will be equally held responsible if India, emboldened by its enhanced military capabilities, decides to launch a military offensive against Pakistan to achieve its limited political objectives. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer the question during discussion session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. Before I invite our next speaker, I would like to ask our attendees to write their questions in question and answer or chat box. Now, our fourth speaker is Dr. Mansoor Ahmad, who will speak on 2 decades of India's nuclear buildup. Over to you, Dr. Mansoor.
Thank you very much. I'll be speaking on the status of India's nuclear weapons program as it has developed over the past 2 decades. I've always been a proponent of the fact that capabilities lead to intentions, and those capabilities need to be factored in the planning of adversaries. Over the past 2 decades, India has silently undergone a latent nuclear revolution, particularly in terms of latent nuclear capabilities, in the full range of nuclear fuel cycle activities outside the safeguards of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm glad that Dr. Rajesh mentioned the point regarding India having fewer warheads than Pakistan, and I'll be addressing that in my talk today as well. India's program around 1998 was truly a modest program compared to what it is today, as was Pakistan's. And both countries over the past 20 years have not only operationalized their strategic nuclear capabilities, but have expanded their fissile material production capacities and stockpiles also. But having said that, there exists a huge asymmetry which is growing and is likely to grow in the near future. India's program is unique in the world because its strategic capabilities primarily are a product of its dual use nuclear energy program, basically. And the fact remains that India has developed its civilian nuclear energy program primarily outside the safeguards of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this was largely codified and the waiver that it had received by the nuclear suppliers group in 2008. And the principles of separation of civil and military facilities as agreed by the IAEA after the India-US deal clearly stated that any nuclear plant or facility in India's program that had a linkage with its strategic weapons capabilities would be placed outside safeguards, whether they were stockpiles or whether they were reactor programs. And that is exactly why India kept much of its breeder program, all of its breeder program, 8 power reactors, heavy water power reactors outside safeguards. It's an enrichment program and other fuel cycle facilities. So from this vantage point, I'd like to emphasize that India has increased its latent nuclear capability. And I'll quote a few figures also. And the figures that I'm going to quote are from the International Panel on Fissile Material, from India's Department of Energy reports, and from the other reports published by the, Princeton University and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So let's start with India's plutonium production in the dedicated production reactors. India has traditionally produced weapons-grade plutonium in 2 reactors, the 100 megawatt Dhruva 1 and the 40 megawatt Ciss reactor, which was shut down around in 2010. Now, the fact is that India, while it shut down the Ciss reactor, it is already in the process of adding another 125 megawatt production reactor and a 35 megawatt research reactor dedicated to producing weapons grade plutonium. These 2 additional reactors will be come online during the current decade. And most of the estimates on India's nuclear warhead equivalent or warhead potential stems from its stockpile of weapons grade plutonium. Now, very interestingly, India has a very large stockpile of civil plutonium outside safeguards, also known as reactor grade plutonium, produced in its indigenous heavy water power reactors, especially the 8 power reactors that have been kept outside safeguards. Now, this material is very much weapon usable. And India has claimed to have conducted at least one test in 1998 using this material. The other point that I'd like to emphasize is that this is high quality reactor grade plutonium. Unlike the reactor grade plutonium produced in other civilian nuclear power plants, such as light water reactors. The reason being that Indian pressurized heavy water reactors operate at around 6,700 megawatt days per ton burn up, and light water reactors that use highly enriched uranium as fuel, or low enriched uranium as fuel rather, they operate at more 30,000 plus megawatt days per ton. So the plutonium produced in India's power reactors, especially the heavy water power reactors, is closer to weapon grades compared to the light water reactors in other countries. The other point is that the capacity factors and the of these reactors have been quite low for much of their operating histories. In addition to that, the other point is that India has been stockpiling this reservoir of civil plutonium outside safeguards in its heavy water power reactors, ostensibly to fuel a breeder program. Now, so far, over the past 15 years, India has failed to commission its first prototype 500 megawatt prototype fast breeder reactor. It has suffered delays of about eight times over the past 15 years. And very interestingly, in March 2018, in response to a query, the Indian Department of Atomic Energy submitted a detailed reply in India's lower house of parliament, the Lok Sabha, in which it stated that that India's Department of Atomic Energy was only aiming at commissioning the first prototype fast breeder reactor, and the other planned reactors, India originally had 5 to 6 planned reactors, may be built later on. Earlier, it was more of a definitive proposition that India will be able to or will be embarking on the construction of the second, third, and the fourth breeder reactor. But naturally, that would depend on the commissioning of its first reactor. So in the absence of the breeder, and India has already fabricated the 2 tons of fuel required for its breeder program. While it has been adding its capacity in the fuel cycle, in the front end of the fuel cycle, it is also increasing the size and efficiency of its fuel reprocessing program. And that fuel reprocessing program has a direct linkage with its breeder program and the stockpile that it has been, which is designated as a strategic reserve. The stockpile that I'm talking about is the civilian plutonium, the reactor grade plutonium that has been produced in India's indigenous heavy water power reactors, and that strategic stockpile of this civil plutonium has been designated by the Indian government as a strategic reserve. That is why it was kept along with the breeder program outside the safeguards of the IAEA. And while all this has been going on, India is increasing the size and efficiency of its reprocessing capability, which is required to separate or reprocess the plutonium from its spent fuel. And I'll just give a rundown of the figures of the stockpiles and the capacities in a while. So in the absence, supposedly India is unable to commission the first fast breeder reactor. This reprocessing capability will be completely free to separate greater amounts of civil plutonium than ever before. If the first prototype fast breeder reactor goes online, it will be a ready source of plutonium production, of weapons-grade plutonium production, and this reprocessing capability can be used and will be used for separating far greater amounts of weapons-grade plutonium than ever before. And same is the story of India's uranium enrichment program, which is said to have been developed primarily for India's naval propulsion requirements. But IHS Janes released a report a couple of years ago in which it said that India was expanding its centrifuge enrichment program that would give it the capacity to produce highly enriched uranium, even up to weapon grade levels, far in excess of its nuclear propulsion program. Now, I'll just like to go through some of the figures, and these are from the IPFM and from the Institute of Science and International Security run by David Albright. So at the end of 1999, India had a estimated stockpile of weapons grade plutonium of about 310 kilograms. At the end of 2019, this increased to about 750 to about 900 kilograms. In terms of reactor grade plutonium, the civil plutonium outside safeguards that I've been talking about, at the end of 1999, it was estimated to have been around 3,400 kilograms. Now it is in excess of about 15 tons. Of that, in 1999, 800 kilograms was separated, which means it was available for weaponization. But now in 2019, about 6 to 10 tons of this plutonium has already been separated. In terms of highly enriched uranium, around 1999, India's stockpile was negligible, only a few hundred kilograms. And now it is said to have produced at least 5 tons of highly enriched uranium, although this is enriched to 30 to 35% for the naval propulsion program. But this capacity can be quickly upscaled to weapons grade level very quickly. And it's just a question of reconfiguring the centrifuge cascades. So in terms of percentages, in terms of weapons grade plutonium, India has registered an increase of about 142% in its weapon grade plutonium stockpile. In terms of separated reactor grade plutonium, it has registered an increase of 1,150%. And in terms of highly enriched uranium, and in this, I would like to say that India is already embarked on a much greater expansion program. They have already registered an increase of 5,000%. In terms of capacities, the 8 power reactors that India had kept outside safeguards under the India-US nuclear deal and the separation plan in 2008, that was around 2350 megawatt. And India has just approved the construction of 10 to 12 additional heavy water power reactors outside safeguards. And that would mean that its power generation capacity of heavy water power reactors outside safeguards would increase by about 282%. If India is able to commission its first fast breeder reactor, then its weapons grade plutonium production capacity would increase from the current 25 kilograms to about 160 kilograms. And that would mean that this would register an increase of about 460%. And in terms of highly enriched uranium, in 1999, the capacity was around 3,000 separative work units. And according to Janes, during this decade, India is going to increase it to about 126,000 separative work units. And this would mean that this would be an increase of about 4,100%. And in terms of reprocessing, the current capacity stands at about 350 tons of heavy metal. And by the end of this decade, India's Department of Atomic Energy has been stating, other leaders have been saying, secretaries of India's DAE and directors of Bhabha Atomic Research Center, they've been saying that India is working on increasing this reprocessing capacity from 350 tons to about 1,900 tons of heavy metal per year. So here I would like to emphasize 2 things. The first is that neither India nor Pakistan have actually declared their stockpiles. Nobody actually knows how much material has been converted or into warheads or has been weaponized. The International Atomic Energy Agency believes that it takes only a few weeks to weaponize stockpiles of fissile material outside safeguards. The other point that I'd like to make is that the fact that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in its latest report on India's nuclear forces and the International Panel on Fissile Materials, they are now accounting India's unsafeguarded civilian plutonium stockpiles that is produced in India's heavy water power reactors as military plutonium stockpile. That, in addition to the fact that the Indian government has and the DAE has kept this stockpile and the breeder program outside safeguards under the separation plan, and had stated that this is the strategic reserve. This stockpile is the strategic reserve, means that this latent capability is there for the taking if and when the Indian political leadership makes such a decision. Now, will they make a decision or not? Nobody knows. What we do know, however, is that there is a subtle but a clear shift in India's doctrinal thinking and its force posture developments. The question of India having more warheads or Pakistan having less warheads or vice versa, I think should be seen in terms of the fissile material production capacities as they exist now and as they are likely to exist over the next decade, and the stockpiles of fissile material holdings outside the safeguards of the IAEA. That can only be the yardstick to determine weapons equivalent weapons equivalent capacities in the absence of any verification mechanism. And India's existing, the kind of strategic missile forces that India has been working on clearly shows the types of missile systems, the thinking that has come out of India's land warfare doctrine, in which it's clearly said that India is planning for a two-front conflict and for a full spectrum conflict simultaneously against China and Pakistan. That means, and the fact that India is now developing certain kinds of dual use systems. For example, Pakistan got a lot of flack for having developed the 67-kilometer range nuclear capable Nasr missile, because the statement that came out by the ISPR was more explicit, when in fact the Indian government conducted a test of the Prahar nuclear capable system a couple of months later, and the DRDO statement said that it can carry all types of warheads. The Nirbhay is said to be the under development and is said to be the backbone of Cold Start. A new kind of lightweight nuclear capable BrahMos version is being tested. That is being integrated to the Sukhoi's Su-30 MKIs for possible counterforce strikes under the India's SFC, the India Strategic Forces Command, which means that they can have a potential nuclear role. And the fact that the Rafale have, in addition to the Mirage 2000 aircraft, another aircraft in India's Air Force inventory, have a capacity of carrying these dual-use platforms, in addition to canisterized versions of India's ballistic missiles and the triad of dual-use cruise missiles, means that India is developing a cruise missile, a counterforce capability based on cruise and ballistic missiles that can potentially be used against Pakistan and China. And from a Pakistani viewpoint, anything that India has against China is potentially available for deployment and employment during a crisis. And the fact that India had deployed preemptively the Arihant, which is a second strike platform during the Balakot crisis, also points in this direction. So in the final analysis, I mean, I would say that India is at the cusp of a nuclear breakout. There are a lot of talk is centered on what Iran is doing, but Iran is a signatory of the NPT. There is a verification mechanism in place. India is a declared nuclear weapon state outside the NPT, and much of its civilian energy program, the three-stage program, exists outside the safeguards of the IAEA. And the fact that India's separation plan and the principles of separation, that was, I think, available on the website of the Indian Embassy in Washington, DC, at least 4 years ago, as far as I can remember. I don't know if it's available there or not today, but that clearly stated that anything that is kept on the military list outside safeguard under the 2008 nuclear separation plan has a dedicated role in India's strategic program. So there's latent hedging capability that has been building up over the past 20 years is simply unprecedented. And the capacities of existing production capabilities in India's military fuel cycle clearly suggest that this expansion is probably the largest single expansion in fissile material, latent fissile material production capabilities outside the anywhere outside the NPT states. And I think that factor is now beginning to probably generate greater anxieties. Earlier, it was only Pakistan. And it also, and these figures are available in the IPFM reports and in the DAE's own annual reports. So this clearly contradicts the fact that Pakistan has a greater nuclear warhead potential than India has. And it also points to the fact that the US Department of Defense latest report, the Pentagon report on China said that now India's nuclear capabilities are now a factor in China's nuclear planning. This is the first time that this was said. And the fact that the experts at the IPFM and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, they are now clearly saying that the civil plutonium stockpile outside the safeguards, whether for the breeder program or not, is part of the military plutonium that India has outside safeguards, should be a factor of concern for India's neighbors, that this capability is out there for the taking if and when India's political leadership decides. And nobody knows when that decision will be made, because there is simply no safeguards mechanism in place. And in the final analysis, I would say that Pakistan is embarked on its own full spectrum deterrence development program. And in no way is Pakistan's program in terms of its existing stockpiles or projected fissile material stockpiles or production capabilities, no way is it able to actually outpace India. In fact, the asymmetry that exists today is likely to exacerbate manifold over the next decade. But as long as Pakistan is able to maintain the credibility of its deterrent and an effective triad for a survivable nuclear force, I think the existing trajectory and planning should be sufficient for its deterrent purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mansoor. I thank all the panelists for their valuable remarks and wonderful presentations. Now we are moving towards question and answer session to further the ongoing discussion. We have few questions in our chat box and some others are coming in this session. As this session is live on YouTube and Facebook as well, so we will take some questions from our social media handle as well. So first question is from Dr. Adil. Sir Humar Rahman from CISS asks that, will the India-US Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement give US access to Indian command and control system? If yes, what could be the potential utility in crisis management in South Asia? And related to BICA, Khalik Ahmad asks that what is and what will be the response of China on BICA?
Okay. Thank you for asking these questions. Ms. Shoma, as I stated, the technical details that are not made public and are not likely to be made public, the contents of BICA agreement. But that was one of the apprehension by the Indians once they finalized this agreement, that some of the data that will be accessible to United States and that can be shared potentially to Pakistan. So they have inserted that clause that even if that data is available to United States, they will not share with Pakistan. And we all know they would have never shared it, but that also indicate probably, yes, they will have access to sensitive information from the Indian military, not necessarily about the command and control, because India would like to jealously guard its command and control. But the details are not very specific about this. The second question is about Khalik. I also read this question, so I'll respond. As I said, we should not see this arrangement, whatever is happening between India and United States, as a zero-sum game, that since India is moving towards United States, so Pakistan should explore options and join hand with Russia and China. This is not the Cold War 1.0. This is a different model. And Pakistan probably would be better off not siding or not being part of any such arrangement, which can lead to potential problems for Pakistan. So in terms of, you said what Pakistan can do, it's, I think Pakistan needs to, for now, what Pakistan can do is, instead of looking for a counter to BICA agreement, it needs to focus on its ISR capabilities, its indigenous ISR capabilities, and probably for the time being, these are good enough. But for the future, yes, definitely, if the threat perception rises where Pakistan can perceive that India or United States is this information or situational awareness or the evolving doctrine that can become potentially threatening to Pakistan, it might have to then look for other means to get that kind of information where it can develop its counter responses also to India's potential military action. But in some, I don't think so. If India is doing, we should be replicating, or we should be reacting that by joining hand with Russia or China. So I just responded because his question was quite elaborate. I hope I have answered his question, Khalid's question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from for Dr. Rajesh. This is from Dr. Mansoor Khan. He asked that when the USA under Trump was pressing for an ever closer US-Indian military relationship, a few months ago, Prime Minister Modi appeared quite reluctant to go for such a relations. Do you think that this is due to concern with India's economic relationship with China, or is India somehow suspicious of US intentions? In other words, is India looking at the US-Pakistani relationship, especially since 9/11, and taking its clues from this case study?
Thank you. I'm not exactly sure which particular episode Dr. Khan is talking about, but irrespective of that, India has been like I was when I was making my presentation, I said that the speed at which India has moved is not something that me and a lot of others are happy with. I mean, I think we should have moved a lot faster. I've been fairly open about that. I've written a lot about that. So India does have a tradition of being reluctant to partner with, in a military sense with other countries. And so I think it is not so much about fear of the US doing something to India, so that 9/11, post 9/11 sort of Pakistani experience is not necessarily not something that we are looking at. But I think there is Indian strategic culture is such that India tends to be a lot more reluctant to go beyond a point in terms of partnering with other countries. I mean, India has of course never had a formal alliance or had even a military relationship, even though we briefly in 62 and 71 we did briefly sort of get close to the US and the Soviet Union respectively, but we never, we quickly got out of that as soon as the crisis was over. So I think the reason for that, to the extent that there is any, as others have, Dr. Sultan and others may talked about the fact that we have, India has signed all these foundational agreements, but the foundational agreements took 20 years, not 20 years, but about 10 years, 10 to 12 years, some of these agreements to be signed, which are basically things that are fairly routine agreements, not even significant agreements, but after 10 years of debate that we signed it. So that again indicates the same point, which is that India tends to be quite reluctant about these kinds of partnerships. If India is nevertheless moving in that direction, it is thanks to China. So I mean, China sort of helped India move in that direction. But otherwise, I think it's entirely domestic reluctance to partner with any country in anything in a form that might appear to be an alliance. And so strategic autonomy, as the term goes, is very strongly held view in India.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Next question is for Dr. Naeem Salik. Adilur Rahman asks that what are the implications of increasing India-US strategic relationship vis-a-vis Indo-Russia long-term defense ties, as India has huge number of Russian weapon systems in service?
I think if you have a look at the history, India has been very successful in maintaining a balance in its relation with the two major powers. Even during the Cold War, while India maintained its non-aligned status, it enjoyed the benefit of all the weapons and equipment, military equipment from the Soviet Union. And once it had a border war with China in 1962, the US came running and piled up equipment worth 9 mountain divisions in India. Uh, they have been very successful even during the Cold War years in maintaining relations with both countries. We also know that after the 74 test, the Soviets did not condemn India because they said if we do that, India will go closer to US. And US did not condemn India's action because they said if we condemn India's action, they will go deeper into Russia's lap. So because of, I think, India's size and its importance, and now particularly as we know, it's a huge market. So because of those reasons, none of these two countries would like to antagonize India. And so India, I think, while it is continuing to have this relationship of arms supplies from the Soviet Union, because it cannot just give it up. Most of its military is equipped with the Soviet equipment and Russian equipment, so it cannot replace it. So it has to continue with that, and therefore it will keep it open, and it's a good source of hard cash for the Soviets, for the Russians. So they will not like to lose this market. So the mere attraction of this huge market potential of India will keep both the major powers interested in India.
Thank you, sir. Next question is for Dr. Mansoor Ahmad. Sumaida Malik asks that keeping in view the latent nuclear capabilities and the Bmd program as elaborated by Dr. Mansoor and Dr. Salik, what would be the viable option for Pakistan since this steady but extremely slow missile development proves detrimental to the strategic stability in South Asia?
Well, my first observation is that I would respectfully disagree. This is not extremely slow. We can have a separate webinar on comparative developments on the missile and nuclear programs of India and Pakistan in terms of the kind of capabilities that have been growing over the past 20 years. I'll re-emphasize that the key is to have a survivable deterrent. Pakistan simply has a deterrent posture. It is not a warfighting posture, even with the addition of short-range, low-yield nuclear weapons systems such as the Nasr. Because Pakistan simply doesn't have the luxury of fielding a very large number of these small weapons, low-yield weapons, short-range weapons for warfighting roles because of a paucity of fissile material in comparative terms to what India has. Whether the Indians go down that route or not, we don't know. The route of developing short-range tactical nuclear weapons. But the instability essentially generates from new kinds of conventional technologies in addition to the nuclear buildup. Hypersonic systems, a conventional, a well-timed, targeted, coordinated, saturated attack using conventional precision-guided cruise missiles against Pakistani command and control strategic assets or deployed strategic systems, low-yield, short-range missile systems in the field can have potentially escalatory consequences. And that can be misconstrued by one side. The other point is that as long as Pakistan has a survivable force that is able to inflict unacceptable damage on India as a viable nation state, I think the credibility of Pakistan's arsenal will can be assured, and Pakistan really doesn't need to go get into this tit for tat nuclear arms race or get into the war fighting mode whatsoever. And I think that has never been Pakistan's position, even though much of the debate outside Pakistan has wrongly or inaccurately projected Pakistan's deterrent posture as a war fighting posture, and also um, wrongly attributed Pakistan's program as being fastest growing and India's program as being slow growing. I mean, at least that's my viewpoint, and uh, I'm now increasingly being supported by reports. At least my viewpoint is being supported by reports of IPFM and Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And these are independent, neutral experts um, speaking on these subjects. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Mr. Usama Nizamani. If there is a prospect of thaw in relationship between China and US after President Biden assumes the presidency, will this have any effects on the ongoing India-China crisis in Ladakh? Is India likely to be at a disadvantage when negotiating possible de-escalation or disengagement with China in Ladakh? Dr. Rajesh or Dr. Adil?
Could you repeat the question? I can't see the question here on the chat box. Is it on the chat box?
No, it's not on chat box.
Okay, sorry. Could you then repeat that question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that properly.
If there is a prospect of thaw in relationship between China and US after President Biden assumes the presidency, will this be any effect on? Will this have any effects on the ongoing India-China crisis in Ladakh? Secondly, is India likely to be at the disadvantage when negotiating possible de-escalation or disengagement with China in Ladakh?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the position that Biden might take once he becomes president on January 20th remains an issue of concern. I mean, I think that is not that we'll have to wait and see how that it's too early to sort of know what exactly his policies would be. There are disagreements within the Democratic Party about what sort of relationship they should have with, as all of you know, with China. And so, should it be a conflictual relationship because of various reasons, trade, technology theft, and so on and so forth, or as some of the more progressive elements within the party suggest, that they need China to deal with climate change issues and so on and so forth. So that, I think, that remains to be seen as to where that would go. But if that were to happen, if China, if the United States makes overtures to a new kind of a G2 approach, then that would definitely have an impact, definitely on US-India relations. I think that, and it will possibly have an impact on India's posture in Ladakh. But I mean, I think it is too early to sort of say, because even though India doesn't expect US to fight alongside it in Ladakh, in that sense, it doesn't directly have an impact, but India does expect that the United States will support it diplomatically and militarily in other ways, not with troops, but in terms of technology, in terms of intelligence, in terms of overall building of India's capabilities over the next several years and so on. So it will have an impact on that. I'm not sure that it will necessarily have an impact on the posture per se, because US is now, nobody expects the US to come and fight at the border for India.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Next question is from Saima Mansyal. Considering, this is from Dr. Rajesh again. Considering what you said about India's conventional capabilities being sufficient against Pakistan, how do you justify India's use of dual-use platforms and early deployment of its naval flotilla alongside its nuclear submarine early in Balakot crisis and threats by Indian Prime Minister Modi of Qatar ki Raat and nuclear weapons not kept for Diwali. Secondly, if India's nuclear deterrence is not poised of conventional or subconventional threats, then what qualifies the vast expansion of India's strategic forces, given, as you said, that India does not intend fighting a war with China?
On the first question, I think, the deployment of the submarine and whatnot. I mean, there is only I think there's like one report about the deployment of the Arihant, but it's not even very clear that it was actually deployed, or I'm not sure that it had its missiles on board. So I think we'll have to wait and see what that was. But in any case, I can understand the the one reason for such a deployment. It was not deployed to the west coast, obviously, but one can understand that you wouldn't want to have your only nuclear submarine get caught in the port if you had a crisis, and when you don't know whether that will escalate or not. So I think that in a precautionary nature of these things, I think it is understandable that India would send its nuclear submarines out. As regards the second question was about why does India? I mean, I'm not sure that I said that India is expanding its strategic forces greatly. In fact, I said about exactly the opposite, that it was growing, but it was very slow and very steady, and not even barely matching even Pakistan's deployed forces as of now. So it is not. I don't think I was suggesting that India's forces are growing with any great rapidity.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. We still have few questions remaining, but we have a time limitation. I would like to invite Ambassador Ali Sarva Nakhvi to conclude the session. Please, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Afira. I'm sorry. There has been some fluctuations in the internet connection. And even now it says your network bandwidth is low. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Sorry. Are you?
We can hear you, sir. We can hear you. Go ahead.
All right. Good. Okay. Thank you for all the speakers in the panel for a very, very useful discussion and highly knowledgeable and well-informed presentations have been made, which was a delight to hear. And I think I will begin with Dr. Rajesh, who gave an Indian perspective on India's missile and nuclear programs, and his key points were very interesting, and that capabilities and behavior matter when discussing strategic stability in South Asia. And of course, he has talked about Pakistan's supposed use of terrorism as a strategy, which we can test. Been labeled on Pakistan, and there is a separate discussion altogether that could be undertaken in that regard. But I think the perspective of India's very calculated and careful, slow progression in developing its capability is an interesting perspective, because we look at it differently. We think that the uh, the whole issue. Uh, you see, nuclear issues in any case are marked by ambiguity. And there is ambiguity, there is dual use, there are all kinds of different aspects of the nuclear phenomena. We think that India has carefully covered its missile development or its fissile development program in such a manner that it does not come out the way the various organizations are looking at them. And then Dr. Mansoor has, of course, brought in the IPFM and data of, in fact, the Indian government itself to show that the progression is pretty good. And that is a source of concern for Pakistan. Because, I'll just mention a small anecdote. I met Dr. Kissinger in New York many years ago, and Dr. Kissinger heard us out, and we talked about the strategic stability of the subcontinent. And he said, I fully understand that you are so concerned about Indian, threat, or pose the possibility of threat that India could pose for you. But what surprises me, and you are perfectly justified in thinking like that because you are smaller and weaker. But what surprises me is when the Indians talk about Pakistan most of the time as their threat. So he said that this is they are a big country, they are a powerful country, so it's very surprising. So I think we have mindsets here which we have to look at, and that's again a separate discussion. But here we have had a presentation of perspectives, and I think, Dr. Rajesh, you have now heard us out and we have heard you. So the audience and the people who are involved are welcome to look at this and draw their conclusions. So I don't want to make this a debate at all, but I'm just making a few observations. And then Dr. Adil's presentation of the agreements, the foundation agreements, and how they would affect security and stability in the region. It was very, very interesting. Mansoor, of course, talked about the Indian nuclear program, which is a very, very big program. So time is run out and we are late in our, I don't want to go on and on, but my sort of offhand observations are what I have just articulated. So I thank you all for this session, and I think we can look forward to further discussion of the India-Pakistan equation as and when we can do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you for your active participation. Goodbye. Allah Hafiz.